One of the things you may have noticed by watching the videos is that the tempos are changing on almost every exercise. I think one thing to note that's important here is that the tempo setting is appropriate, it needs to be appropriate for the particular exercise that they're doing. So at the beginning, slower is better, so that way they're focused on the small things, the mastery of the fundamentals, the technique. And then later, especially in the exercise that you're about to see, tempo is a little bit more important, that it's brighter, that it's faster, that it's a little bit more challenging. It's also that it's a little bit more fun and engaging and exciting for the players as well. So our next exercise is what we call a chromatic lip slur. And here's where I start to change what the woodwinds do versus what the brass do. Initially, at the beginning of every set, they play dee 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 dee, and it's a legato tonguing exercise that goes into a lip slur for the brass that you'll hear. And then while they're doing that, the woodwinds are going through a chromatic evolution that goes along with the lip slur that the brass are doing. So from the bottom of the pitch going back up, and it's challenging them to turn around on certain notes that they're not necessarily used to doing in common practice. And so it's a great exercise for your woodwinds to be prepared to play a variety of chromatic scales that do a variety of things that challenge them a little bit more technically than the things that we may have done earlier in the warm-up. So please take notice of the chromatic lip slur. And again, to point out with the chromatic lip slur that the woodwind hand position was very solid. All fingers were down essentially on the home base keys the entire time. Excellent hand position and finger placement leads to better technique. So it's really important that their fingers are not flying off the keys and becoming unattached to the instrument, that they're basically staying down in that curved hand position, and they're essentially staying touching the keys and covering those home bases, so that way they can play any note at any time. So again, woodwind hand position, extremely important. For the brass, this is about embouchure manipulation and airstream. So once they get past the legato eighth notes, it's going to the partials above and below smoothly, and using that airstream and that free vibration of aperture to create a beautiful tone. Also want to point out, with all of our exercises, we expect a slight 2% crescendo release at the end of each phrase. So it's very important that as they finish a phrase, that there's a slight shape, there's an intent to the ends of phrases. I think doing that in warm-up also lends itself better to transitioning that to performance music, where the expectation really ought to be there's intent of shape, whether it is the intent of crescendo, or we are definitely wanting to diminuendo into a tasteful release. Either way, it's the teaching of that skill in warm-up and in fundamentals that leads to connect to performance music. The next phase after the chromatic lip slur, we have an examination of the various weights and lengths of articulations. I think one of the things that's really important inside of warm-up is to define what does a legato quarter note look and sound like, and exactly how long is that note, and how are we approaching doing that from a fundamental standpoint. We also examine accent, marcato, and staccato. We keep them in the four basically neutral positions, so that we have differences between those particular articulations. So you're going to hear a very direct comparison with space in between to allow the students to really think about their length of sound, how they're going about the process of articulating, and making sure that they're matching from player to player. I think from a teacher's standpoint, it'd be very, very helpful for us as directors to take our instruments out and to play for our students. I'm going to play 4 accented quarter notes, and to play it to them and have them play it back and talk about, is mine louder or softer, higher or lower, shorter or longer, things of that nature, and to model these articulation qualities, but then also have them in warm-up so that way you're comparing and contrasting the various note lengths, and you're basically taking inventory of the process of articulation all the way through. After we do that comparison, I take them right into an immediate articulation pattern exercise that kind of sets the plate for further articulation exercises in the next set. But these are paired together because I think they transition well between establishing the style versus now we're going to start directly applying staccato to faster notes. As a director, making sure that you consistently preach to your ensembles about the varieties of note lengths relative to articulation. So when it's a legato, it should be a long note that's connected and essentially touching the next note. If it's an accented note, what that really means is just a dynamic louder on that particular note, maybe a slightly more articulate front, but you want a full-length note with a lot of body and a lot of energy on the front, but it's essentially a louder note than the others. Marcato is a 3/4 length note with some space behind it. It's a fairly firm articulation on the front. And then finally, staccato being short and light and essentially half the value of the note. So preaching that to the ensemble, playing that, modeling that as a director so they can hear the different sounds and the definitions, and then having it in warm-up I think is really, really important that we're defining it. Also notice while they played that every time they stayed set, they got their embouchure set, they took a 2-count breath, and then they would play whatever it is the articulation was. At the end, they were exhaling their old air, they were taking in new air, and then setting the new thing. So really we're tying in all of the fundamentals that we did before, all the way back to breathing gym, and then linearly all the way through the exercise into now articulations. Finally, we finish with some staccato patterns that are really designed to teach short and light with fast air, so making sure that there's a lot of fast air going through the note. We're lightly articulating with 1 or 2 taste buds, just ever so lightly touching. There's direction through the note, so you should have heard ticka-ticka-dom. There's a slight direction through the note at the end all the way through. And finally, keeping that embouchure and that face stable. You shouldn't see a lot of chewing or moving or jaw movement through articulation. That means they're overworking that muscle. They're overproducing, and that's not something that's desirable as well. Finally, there was a really nice 2% shape at the end of it. So all of these things tied together kind of vertically line up and reinforce all the fundamentals throughout.